So yeah, we'll just crack on from where we left off. Put you there. I mean, even at the end of the last paragraph where he goes, the vast area of speculation covered by philosophy will be appreciated best after a brief consideration of a few of the outstanding systems of philosophic discipline. I mean, it's his idea of what the outstanding systems are.
That's his book.
Yeah, it is his book, true, you're right. The Greek school of philosophy had its inception with the 7 immortalized thinkers, upon whom was first conferred the appellation of Sophos, the wise. Yeah, like Sophia is a wise thing.
Philosophy.
Yeah. According to Diogenes Laertius, these were Thales, Solon, Chilon, Pittacus, Bias, Cleobulus, and Periander.
Periander.
Yeah, it's a nice word, isn't it?
Yeah, I quite liked it.
Where's my glasses? I'll put my glasses on. These are pretty names. Water was conceived by Thales to be the primal principle or element, upon which the earth floated like a ship, and earthquakes were the result of disturbances in this universal sea. Since Thales was an Ionian, the school perpetuating his tenets became known as the Ionic. He died in 546 BC and was succeeded by Anaximander, who in turn was followed by Anaximenes, Anaxagoras, and Archelos. I'm probably not pronouncing a lot of them right, but
I'm not too sure it's important.
no, it's not, and I'm not a Greek, with whom the Ionic school ended. Anaximander, differing from his master Thales, declared measureless and indefinable infinity to be the principle from which all things were generated. I mean, I think that's again non-duality there, measureless and indefinable infinity. First of all, like, you know, Thales, he said it's water, and then he tried to say it's one single thing and then everything comes out of that water. But he's just saying it's this unknowable thing, that's what makes everything. I would go with Anaximander on that rather than Thales. Anaximenes asserted air to be the first element of the universe, that souls and even the deity itself were composed of it. Anaxagoras, whose doctrine savours of atomism, that's Anaximander, isn't it? Yeah. Held God to be an infinite self-moving mind, that this divine infinite mind, not enclosed in any body, is the efficient cause of all things. Out of the infinite matter consisting of similar parts, everything being made according to its species by the divine mind, who, when all things were at first confusedly mingled together, came and reduced them to order. I mean, that's the idea that first of all there's just this undifferentiated stuff, and then the divine mind comes in and it separates it all out and then creates everything from that, you know, order out of chaos.
Yeah.
Out of the ether, yeah. But it's still the non-dual principle, because in a sense it's what our minds are doing. It's like our minds are either like kind of, we're taught concepts like tree and ground and air and up and down, and then we use these concepts to separate our experience out into them. Because really, what you really experience is just a load of colours, and that's it. Anaxagoras, I said that. Archelos declared the principle of all things to be twofold: mind, which was incorporeal, and air, which was corporeal. The rarefaction and condensation of the latter resulting in fire and water respectively. The stars were conceived by Archelos to be burning iron plates. That's pretty cool, just flat plates in heaven.
Very hot. Iron plates.
Yeah. Heraclitus, who lived from 536 BC to 470 BC, and is sometimes included in the Ionic school, in his doctrine of change and eternal flux, asserted fire to be the first element, and also the state into which the world would ultimately be reabsorbed. The soul of the world he regarded as an exhalation from its humid parts, and he declared the ebb and flow of the sea to be caused by the sun. I mean, Heraclitus, I think what he's saying there when he talks about fire being the first element, not so much the fire that you see. I think they're using that symbolically or allegorically. But what fire does, it dissolves everything. You get this fixed form, and you put it in the fire, and it becomes just ash. It dissolves it, and so that's the principle, the constant flux. I mean, Heraclitus was famous for saying you'd never stand in the same river twice. And I would say out of a lot of the pre-Socratic philosophers, I'd go for Heraclitus. After Pythagoras of Samos, its founder, the Italic or Pythagorean school numbers among its most distinguished representatives Empedocles, Epicharmus, Achatus, Alcmaeon, Hippasus, Philolaus, and Eudoxus. Pythagoras, from about 500 to 500 BC, conceived mathematics to be the most sacred and exact of all the sciences, and demanded of all who came to him for study a familiarity with arithmetic, music, astronomy, and geometry. Mathematics is essentially the study of pattern, I think, just like they're without a particular pattern. He laid special emphasis upon the philosophic life as a prerequisite to wisdom. Pythagoras, which I quite bullshit on. You don't need to have a philosophic life to understand things and know things. Some of the most awake people I've known, and I think you've known, have led very unphilosophic lives or very unvirtuous lives. Pythagoras was one of the first teachers to establish a community wherein all the members were of mutual assistance to one another in the common attainment of the higher sciences. A bit like what I'm trying to do with my YouTube channels and building up that network. He also introduced the discipline of retrospection. You can butt in whenever you want. He also introduced the discipline of retrospection as an essential to the development of the spiritual mind. Pythagoreanism may be summarized as a system of metaphysical speculation concerning the relationship between numbers and the causal agencies of existence. This school also first expounded the theory of celestial harmonics or the music of the spheres. I mean, that's interesting because
stars certainly seem to look like they're kind of fluctuating at different frequencies.
What stars do?
Yeah, when you zoom in on different stars with a telescope, they all kind of look a little bit different. They've got this weird kind of ripple to them. It's like electricity kind of.
And they have different
harmonics.
lights, different light frequencies and different colours. So yeah, definitely. And that's what you could be talking about, the music of the spheres.
Like blue looking. It's a cool looking star.
Naboo looking?
No, very blue looking.
Yeah.
Vega. It's just right outside my bedroom window. Most of the time,
Cool.
Obviously, they move around.
John Reuchlin said of Pythagoras that he taught nothing to his disciples before the discipline of silence. Silence being the first rudiment of contemplation. I mean, in a sense, you see that when you watch your own experience. It's silence that your thoughts come out of and go back into. And in a sense, it's kind of that nothing that everything arises out of and goes back into. All these kind of apparent forms, it's not that they're coming from, as Plato would say, an ideal realm of the forms. They're just nothing coming on as this form and then going away and going back to nothingness and coming on as another form. In his Sophist, Aristotle credits Empedocles with the discovery of rhetoric, which is basically the study of argumentation, how to convince people of stuff. Both Pythagoras and Empedocles accepted the theory of transmigration, the latter saying, "A boy I was, then did a maid become, a plant, bird, fish, and in the vast sea swum." Achatus is credited with invention of the screw and the crane. Transmigration is just another word for reincarnation. Pleasure he declared to be a pestilence because it was opposed to the temperance of the mind. He considered a man without deceit to be as rare as a fish without bones. Yeah, and this is why I don't always think, because he's always highlighting these kind of very superficial values. Like, yeah, everything we kind of think is in terms of value, like the truth value and stuff like that. But here it's like what Empedocles was doing, or Achatus is saying when he calls pleasure a pestilence, it's like setting a man at war with himself, and there's no need to.
It's a need if you want
power over people.
if you want an unfair advantage.
You got to make them feel guilty and then weak. So you got to give them a standard to which they'll fail to achieve, and then they'll be like, "Oh, poor little me."
Measure themselves to
Exactly.
give them the measuring kind of.
And then you try and
give them the units of which they could measure them by.
yeah.
And they'll do so.
And then they'll think, "Oh, I'm not achieving this, but he's achieving that. I've got to do what he says." The Eleatic sect was founded by Xenophanes, or Xenophanes, who was conspicuous for his attacks upon the cosmologic and theogonic fables of Homer and Hesiod. Xenophanes declared that God was one and incorporeal, in substance and figure round, in no way resembling man, that he is all sight and all hearing, but breathes not, that he is all things, the mind and wisdom, not generate, but eternal, impassible, immutable, and rational. Xenophanes believed that all existing things were eternal, that the world was without beginning or end, and that everything which was generated was subject to corruption. He lived to great age, and is said to have buried his sons with his own hands. Parmenides studied under Xenophanes, but never entirely subscribed to his doctrines. Parmenides declared the senses to be uncertain and reason the only criterion of truth. He first asserted the earth to be round, and also divided its surface into zones of heat and cold. I mean, right, what they reason is just a putting together thing. It puts together the elements that the senses give to it. So if the senses are uncertain and you can't trust them, then the conclusions you draw from the data the senses give is going to be uncertain, and this is the same problem there. And then separating the world, saying God is incorporeal and insubstantial and stuff like that, you then got to say, what is this world that we're in now? And you inevitably fall into a kind of dualism between this one perfect, immovable, never changing, round thing that's all hearing and but no breathing, and then you've got this corporeal world here. And then when you think about the realm in which the gods are meant to be, it's bloody boring. They're just like round, perfect little balls that do fuck all forever and ever, well, in no time at all.
They're round, perfect balls.
Yeah, that's kind of...
doing nothing at all.
Yeah.
Who says the gods
Well, Plato, in one of his things, he talks about... I mean, he was saying here, it goes... Xenophon declared that God was one and incorporeal, in substance and figure round, in no way resembling man, because a circle was meant to be perfection, you know. And I mean, all these descriptions of perfection, you kind of look at them, and if you're honest with yourself, and then you think that, and then you look at how they describe perfection, you'd be like, well, I don't want to be perfect because it just sounds boring. It's not the kind of life I'd like to exist.
Circles are pretty awesome, aren't they?
Yeah, but I mean,
they haven't got any sharp corners. Incredible.
Yeah.
I get what you're saying. I'm a bit disappointed that you don't see how perfect and wonderful balls are.
Oh no, balls are... I like balls. Everywhere you stand on the sphere, you're on top of it.
The Earth isn't one though.
It might not be, I don't know. Melissus, who is included in the Eleatic school, held many opinions in common with Parmenides. He declared the universe to be immovable because, occupying all space, there was no place to which it could be moved. He further rejected the theory of a vacuum in space. Zeno of Elea also maintained that a vacuum could not exist. Rejecting the theory of motion, he asserted that there was but one God who was an eternal, ungenerated being. Like Xenophanes, he conceived deity to be spherical in shape. Leucippus held the universe to consist of two parts, one full and the other a vacuum. From the infinite, a host of minute fragmentary bodies descended into the vacuum, where, through continual agitation, they organised themselves into spheres of substance. That's quite funny, really. So loads of bits of the infinity drop off from the infinity, fall into the vacuum, where they piss each other off, and then they become what they are through that mutual kind of pissing each other off.
Yeah.
Essentially what you're saying. That's also the premise, the idea there of how suffering is what causes us to become who we are, kind of thing. And you could say that what an ego is, what a person is like the pearl, which is caused by the oyster dealing with the agitation generated by a grain of dirt that goes in. The great Democritus, to a certain extent, enlarged upon the atomic theory of Leucippus. Democritus declared the principles of all things to be twofold, atoms and vacuum. Both, he asserted, are infinite. Atoms in number, vacuum in magnitude. Thus all bodies must be composed of atoms or vacuum.
So why are they thinking vacuum? Are they just making the assumption that sort of like one is full, so the other has to be empty?
Well, it's kind of, you need, in order for there to be something,
Balance it.
there has to be nothing for that something to be in. Yeah. Otherwise you wouldn't know what something is.
Yeah.
So we know what a shape is, or because it occupies a bit of space, and it's not the space around it. Right. So there needs to be an inside and an outside for there to be a thing, kind of thing. Thus all bodies must be composed of atoms or vacuum. I mean, it says that's pretty much the theory that we have, isn't it? You got all the atoms that make up the molecules in our body.
The atoms touch or anything; they're all kind of orbiting around each other, isn't it?
Yeah, and even in the atom, it's just a couple of particles, and most of it's space. But that isn't the atom that the Greeks meant. For the Greeks, it just meant you take something and you cut it, and then you cut it again, and you keep on cutting it, and eventually you'll get to a point where you can't cut it anymore. Yeah, and so atoms just means uncuttable. So what we call atoms now are not the Greek atoms. Atoms possess two properties: form.
I'm made out of loads of imaginary little balls.
You don't think you are? No, I don't think I am. I think all that there really is kind of experience, and then we make up various hypotheses, and we use certain interpretive strategies to explain experience. And what explanation is the attempt to control a thing. So depending on what it is you want to get out of the explanation, that determines what interpretive method or what kind of way you're going to break it up will be. But all these interpretations, they don't exist in themselves. There is just this happening, and we make up all sorts of things that enable us to manipulate this and like make cars and stuff.
So you can make a car because you imagine that you're made out of loads of little balls.
Yeah. It's a physical.
What's the practical application of?
Well, with the little balls thing, they're able to.
Made out of loads of little balls.
Well, with the little balls thing, they're able to generate the molecular theories, which enable them to understand how hydrocarbons work. And then, but actually, on the level of the car, you just need a mechanical understanding of stuff, and that is that there's things act against each other.
By distilling crude oil that you can separate out into different things, I don't think there's any need to imagine that all of it's made out of little balls.
Not necessarily, but what the atom hypothesis has done by leading to the molecular hypothesis has enabled us then to go out into laboratories and synthesize chemicals and compounds, because we can do the maths that involves manipulating those little balls and those different atoms and how they interact with each other.
Because it's necessary just so you have something to visually imagine.
Yeah, and so through that we've been able to create a mathematical language, and that predicts certain characteristics of what the compounds might do, and what compounds can be created. But yeah, the balls don't necessarily have to exist. You could imagine another interpretive method or another kind of like basic components of reality that could result in the same kind of ability to manipulate the reality. The sole Democritus also conceived. Thus all
because your model works doesn't mean
it's true.
Other models
won't work, and doesn't mean it's absolutely true. That's what the scientific thing's all about. Like science progresses through kind of revolutions. So the Newtonic model that worked for most predictions, and most of science is you get a theory coming up, and all experimentation is trying to get that theory or trying to get the data to fit the theory, and so they have puzzles. And the way and what generally happens after a while is there are certain data which generates puzzles which a theory can't solve. So in the Newtonian model, there were observations about how the moon's orbited the moon, and perturbations in Mercury's moon's orbits or Mercury's orbit. that the Newtonian model couldn't explain. But for hundreds and hundreds of years, the Newtonian model was still declared as true because it was the only one they had. And then Einstein came along with a new model that explained all the problems of all the things that the Newtonian model could explain, plus the puzzles that the Newtonian model could not explain. And then they chucked away Newton's model and chose that one. So science progresses through these kind of revolutions. It's not this strict kind of logical progression at all. It takes it takes an imaginative leap, to progress in it. Atoms possess two properties.
Or to like plug holes in failed theories, just to keep prop them up.
That's what they keep doing. Yeah, keep propping them up, and they'll generally ignore the puzzles that they cannot solve. Yeah.
Call them outliers or something.
Yeah, and so I mean, most science goes on by people being religious adherents to a certain theory, and then they're trying to prove that theory, and then as the paradoxes and irresolvable problems build up, that builds up a kind of tension and a kind of conflict within the scientific community of generally between the outliers and the proponents of the system. So you'll have the people who go to uni and are in the labs, they're doing work to prove a theory, and that's how they get their PhDs and their doctorates, and that's how they get the applause of the consensual community that they're in. And then you'll have the outliers who will keep pointing out, look, but your theory doesn't explain this, your theory doesn't explain that. And as more and more things arise that the theory doesn't explain, it produces a kind of world context or world or way of things, which makes it possible for a new theory to come up and be accepted. What's that? But I got a wasp by my ear. No.
Yeah.
Is it a wasp, is it? Fuck off. I hate wasps. Socrates, the founder of the... Wait on, I came back. Thus, all bodies must be composed of atoms or vacuum. Atoms possess two properties, form and size, both characterized by infinite variety. The soul, Democritus, also conceived to be atomic in structure and subject to dissolution with the body. The mind, he believed, to be composed of spiritual atoms. Aristotle intimates that Democritus obtained his atomic theory from the Pythagorean doctrine of the monad. Among the Eleatics are also included Protagoras and Anaxarchus. Yeah, we're done.